morning, everyone. Wow, this is loud. Good morning. So I'm the second environmental psychologist. We're like buses. You don't see us for years and then two arrive at once. But today I'm going to talk about psychoacoustics, which is a real passion of mine. Now, we know that offices are noise is one of the biggest causes of dissatisfaction in offices. And if you don't believe that, this is an example here. This is analysis by the Leesman Index. They asked over 100,000 people what they thought of their office, 100,000 people in 50 countries. And you can see that noise is the second biggest cause of dissatisfaction after thermal comfort. And also, noise is the biggest cause of lack of productivity in the office. And again, Leesman, our Leesman Index friends, in their survey, they found that 53% of people thought that only 53% of people thought the office supported their productivity. So almost a half of people believe the office is not allowing them to perform. But how much does it affect productivity? How much does noise affect productivity? Well, a few years ago, I ran an analysis of over 200 research papers where they'd quantified the impact of different environmental factors on productivity. And quite a lot of studies, quite a range of results, but what we did is we weighted it for whether the study was carried out in the real world or a lab, whether it was measured using proper performance tasks like business metrics, or whether it was some kind of key press or small task. And you can see here the results from the various environmental factors. And whilst acoustics is 0.2 to 1.7% impact on productivity when you consider all those studies, and you might think, well, that's not much, really, 1.7%, why are we bothering? But the point is that we know that just a 5% increase in productivity can actually pay completely for your property costs. So although we're talking small numbers, they are actually very, very relevant. So I want to talk about noise and acoustics. So first of all, we all know what noise is. Common definition, it's unwanted sound. But did you know, again, when we looked at the literature, and this was some work done with Ecofon, myself, and Paige Hodson, when we looked at the literature, the common conclusion was that sound level only accounted for about 25% of the variance in the response to noise. So there's 75% of other stuff happening that we're not even looking at. And again, the studies suggest that 50% are psychological factors. So my view is we're kind of focusing on the wrong thing. If we're obsessed with sound levels and how they correlate with dissatisfaction and performance, we're looking at the wrong thing. We need to look at the psychology, at the psychoacoustics. And I don't want to dwell on this, but as I said, from what I've gained of your industry, there's a lot of debate, a lot of discussion about how we measure sound level. You even talk about how we weight it so that it represents what people hear. And there's a lot of jargon. For occupiers and someone new to the industry, there's a lot of jargon. And to be honest, it's just confusing. We don't know what it means. And as I said, and even if you get all that right, you're only looking at 25% of the impact of noise on people. So let's look at the other 75%. And that's where psychoacoustics comes in. So you can read what psychoacoustics is there, but my short definition is this. It's simply how people perceive, interpret, and react to sound. And quite often we focus on the sound outside the head. So pressure waves hit the ear, we convert that into perceived sound. But then we undergo cognition. And in that cognitive process, we interpret that sound differently. And that's when we determine whether it's noise or not. So I think most people focus on the outside, the head. Well, I'm interested in what goes on inside the head, because that's what matters. And again, if you look at the literature, there are 4 key factors that affect our perception and interpretation of noise. And I'll just go through each of those individually. So perceived control is an interesting one. And I think one of the best studies to illustrate perceived control was studies done by Glass and Singer, where again, they put people in a lab, and some people, they expose them to predicted sound interruptions, and other ones, the sound was random. And what they found is, if the sound was not predictable, outside of the control of the person, their performance dropped. But this is what I found fascinating. That drop in performance carried on for 24 hours. So they repeated the study the next day, and those people were so upset or so disturbed that their performance continued to degrade. So perceived control is important. Then context and attitude. And I think this is fascinating stuff. Now, the difference between an environmental psychologist and a normal psychologist is we're interested in how people behave in the built environment. And the other thing we believe is that we believe that our perception of that environment is not just dependent on the physical aspects of it, it's also dependent on our experience and expectations. So our personal factors affect how we even perceive the world. And I'll give you examples of that. And you all know the example I'm going to give, the dripping tap. The dripping tap, very small sound level, but at night, if you're trying to sleep, that is the most disturbing sound in the world. And you sit in bed wondering whether, shall I get up and turn it off, or shall I just sit here and put up with it? And we've all been through that. The other one I like, just to talk about social context. If you, at night, you hear an ambulance going down the street, full of sirens, or a fire engine, you're more likely to be forgiving of that than maybe someone digging up the road at 6 a.m. in the morning. And the other one I like to give is the rock concert. So in the UK, you have Glastonbury, and you've got the kids down at Glastonbury, and they're right at the front of the stage where the speakers are. The Stapedi's reflexes come in, so you know the bones have separated in their ears are bleeding, and they're really enjoying that concert. And there's people 3 miles away, sitting in the gardens with their gin and tonics, thinking, what is that noise? So it's totally dependent on context and social elements. And then the other one, which I'll only briefly touch on today, is evolutionist psychology, and that's already come up. But the idea there that our brains have also evolved over the millennia, over about 4 million years, and our brains evolved to accommodate us to survive on the African savannah. But we've only been in offices about 100, 150 years. So our brains are still tuned to external noises, natural sounds, birdsong, waterfalls, and at a particular level. So, whereas in the office, we're basically out of sync with that natural world. Okay, so I want to talk now about the personality types. I've already mentioned personality as being one of the key factors. And years ago in the 30s, Allport, they looked at how you describe personality, and they came up with 14,000 descriptors. And ever since then, psychologists have been trying to reduce that to some manageable number. And Eysenck came up with 2 scales or 4 definitions. And I'm only going to talk about 2 of those today, introversion and extroversion. Extroverts in the audience, you'll recognize them. Extroverts are the people who, they're people. They like people's company. They're the people who are more, they're risk takers, they're thrill seekers. They're more likely to stand up in meetings and talk about stuff with no regard. And the introverts, they're the people who are a bit more thoughtful. They like their own company, they're more thoughtful, they go away, they think things through. They're very good at detail, complex analysis, and so on. So who thinks they might be extrovert? Who are the social, gregarious, outgoing? Okay. So the introverts, I want you to stand on your chairs and shout, I'm an introvert. No, it's not going to happen. Okay, so we've got 2 scales. And this is brilliant, because Sarah's already told you all about the Yerkes-Dodson and arousal theory, so I don't have to do that. But what I want to add to it is this. So just to remind you, we've all got a natural level of arousal, state of arousal. If it's low, you're going to feel lethargic, a bit drowsy, and as a consequence, you're not going to perform well. And if your level of arousal is too high, you're going to be stressed out. And again, your performance is going to degrade because you're just not coping. And this is where it gets both interesting and complicated. If you're an extrovert, you have a natural low level of arousal. So you're constantly seeking stimulation. Which means in noisy, buzzy, stimulating environments, you thrive, you love it. Whereas a poor old introvert, they already have a natural high state of arousal. So if you put those in noisy, stimulating environments, they're going to suffer, and they're going to get stressed out. So you can see how this affects how we create environments. And it gets more complicated, because then we have to look at the tasks, the thing people do. And the more complex the task, the more stimulating it is. So now we've got all these variables interacting. We've got introversion, extroversion, task, complex, simple. And I've tried to summarize this, or Paige and I tried to summarize this in a diagram. I've probably rewritten this diagram 4 or 5 times because it's just so complicated to try and manage all these variables. But basically, what it comes down to is if, for example, you're an introvert, low level of arousal, doing complex tasks, sorry, high level of arousal, introvert, doing complex tasks, you're going to find noisy stimulations both distracting, disturbing, and affect your performance. At the other end of the scale, if you're an extrovert, so you're seeking stimulation, and you're doing a boring, simple task, you're going to find quiet environments not good for your performance. So you will get this slide, but it is a complicated slide. But what it means is that we have to understand the makeup of people in the office in order to create the right acoustic environments for them. So I'm going to go on to, well, what do we do all about that? Now, actually, anyone who's coming to the session tomorrow, I'm going to give you more data on that. I'm going to share some actual statistics, numbers, because I know you guys love numbers. So, but I'm not doing that today, I'm just doing an overview. So what I wanted to do today with our work is we're then doing personality profiling of the different teams in the space. And what we're doing is, if there's a high proportion of introverts or a high proportion of extroverts, design the space to meet their needs as well as offering choice. And then, of course, avoid speakerphones and so on. And then the other thing is, obviously, we reduce noise, and that's where, acoustic treatments come in particular, and I think that's the focus there. My big beef at the moment, particularly in the UK, I don't have an issue with open plan environments. I think good, well-designed open plan environments can work, or let's call it landscaped environments, Bürolandschaft. But what I have an issue with is desks getting smaller, getting closer together, high-density environments where people are on top of each other, where there's no desk screen, no desk partitions, no desk screens, and that is just not good for reducing noise. And there's a big debate about whether you allow headphones or not. And I think, if that's a choice people want, allow them headphones, but develop some etiquette around headphone use. And then the other thing is, if you are going to consider sound masking, think of the evolutionary psychology and maybe consider sound masking and I think soundscapes, and I think we're getting a talk on that later. And that may be something that goes through the headphones as well. So we reduce noise. And then the final thing, which is probably the most difficult one, is how we educate people. And so this is about the office etiquette. This is about how we sit down with people and we say, do you know what, it is actually okay for you to say to that person, can you take your loud voice and move it somewhere else? Can you go and have your meeting, 3 people at a desk, can you go and have that somewhere else? But it's really difficult to do, especially us English. We do not like to speak up and say that. I spoke to someone once and she was constantly complaining about colleagues coming up next to her and having meetings and arguments, and then talking about the football and the rugby and whatever. And I said, why don't you just tell them to move? And she said, no, I can't do that. I have to go and move myself. And, so we need to give these people, we need to empower people to allow them to say these things. We can use do not disturb signals. I'm not a big fan of hats and flags and all the rest of it. But what you can do is you can train people to know when someone is busy. If they are typing with their head down and they're in the zone, they probably don't at that point want to be asked a question, but some people don't understand those visual signals. And I mentioned perceived control. Perceived control is all about making sure people understand how the office works, where the noise sources are, if something particular is happening which is a source of noise, or if there are particularly noisy groups, just getting people to understand those. And I'm trying to bring all this together into a model where basically, and we're developing a tool. The first thing we do is we do that evaluation. So we do all the physical or the acoustic evaluations. We look at the activities of people doing, where they do them, how long they're doing them for. We do personality profiling across the whole group. And we also look at background variables, individual factors. We found things like age have a big impact on noise perception. And what that means is that you can then start to think about what work settings do I need, where should they be? How should they be laid out? And should I think about my teams in terms of adjacencies, how they work together? Or should I think about teams in terms of what are a high mix of introverts like a finance group versus what's a high mix of extroverts like a sales group, and start to think about how I organize those? And then we train people in how to behave. It sounds a bit condescending, but we train people in how to behave in an open plan environment and how to curb their enthusiasm. And that allows us to bring in a source of expertise, acousticians, designers and architects to look at the layout, the zoning, and obviously behavioral psychologists to look at how we help people change their behavior. So that is it. I've got 2 minutes. There's 2 papers. You can if you email myself or Paige from Ecofont, we will email you the papers back and have a good read. They're long. They're both about 40 pages each.
Excellent. Nigel, thank you.